Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Castlen Kennedy, and I am Lyceum class of 2015. I also have the honor of serving as the president-elect for the Texas Lyceum. I'd like to welcome you to the latest in our installment of panels discussing COVID-19 and its impact on the state of Texas. Today, we've got a great panel planned for you looking at energy. The energy industry is obviously a very important part of the Texas economy. It drives significant GDP, it drives significant employment, and it drives significant revenue for both the counties and at the state level. So the impact of what is happening today in the energy industry, and in particular the oil and gas industry, is quite significant for our state. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I want to do just a couple of things. First, I want to thank Dan Pickering with Pickering Energy Partners. Dan is a friend and a supporter of the Texas Lyceum. And in your invitation for this webinar, Dan included, or rather recorded a video for all of us as a primer to some of the macro issues and supply and demand issues that have been happening in global oil markets over the past month. So a big thank you to Dan for that. I also want to make a plug for the Texas Lyceum. We recently opened applications for our 2021 director class. And I want to encourage anyone who's interested in becoming a director in the Texas Lyceum, or for our alums or active directors tuning in, please consider forwarding that or sharing that information with folks you think would make great directors. And you can find out more info on that on texaslyceum.org. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator today, Stephen Robertson with the Permian Basin Petroleum Association. He's an executive vice president there, a trade association that represents producers in the Permian Basin, and a member of the class of 2017. So with that, I will turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you, Castlen, and thank you everybody else for joining us today. This pandemic has hit all aspects of not just our local lives, our state lives, our national lives, but really the world. Similar to the way that energy production impacts the entire world. In particular, that occurs in the state of Texas really has an impact on things that happen around the world. So we were really enthusiastic to get to share some different points of view that we're going to be able to talk about today from folks of all different facets of the industry, to really see what's going on, what it took to get to kind of where we were at, what's going on right now, both from private actors and from government actors, and what we can kind of look at going forward. And in the big picture is how that impacts Texans, how that impacts in particular those Texans outside the energy industry. We've got three really great panelists that are representatives of the Lyceum and have given a lot of time before and are continuing to give time now, and we're really fortunate to have them. We've got Grant, who comes to us from a background on the service side of the oil and gas industry. In particular, currently he is the president of an organization that offers services that focus a lot on helping to reduce some of the environmental issues that folks deal with, in particular when it comes to emissions. We've got Royce, who has a good storied background on the legislative front, the lobby front, and has several clients in the energy space as well as clients outside. And he's going to be able to provide us a perspective on what's really changing or could be changing outside the legislative cycle in Texas, but that could really benefit those in the industry and those in the state of Texas. And we've also got Bill, who is an operator and who is really seeing the impacts of the changing price market out there firsthand. In particular, when we were putting together this panel, and asking these gentlemen to participate, none of us knew what was going to happen on Monday and Tuesday of this week and the following price fluctuations that we've experienced. But it makes this panel and this week even more appropriate to have. So we're so fortunate to have these people involved, so fortunate to have so many of you out there listening to us. And as you have any questions, you were provided my email address. Please send me any emails that you have, or use the chat function. I think we can do that to try to submit some questions. But just to kind of get started off, the oil and gas industry, interestingly enough, the Permian Basin celebrated 100 years of production in 2020. through that 100 years for the Permian Basin and for a slightly larger time frame for the state of Texas, oil has been an important commodity and important part of our economy. We've seen ups and downs. We've seen prices go up for the commodity. We've seen prices go down. Earlier this week and really the last few weeks, we've seen a downtrend in price. But this feels a lot different than any kind of downturn we've had before. Gentlemen, and I might start specifically with Bill on this one. Is this different than what we've experienced before? And if it is or if it isn't, give us your 2 cents on what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's different from this standpoint. I've been in the business 35 or 40 years, and we had much the same thing in a way in 1986, where the price of oil came down to 10 and Saudi flooded the market. But we didn't have the coronavirus. And I have never in my life seen the trade on oil, on the physical trade on oil, go minus 34. So it's been much more precipitous because we have a demand problem that's not solvable at this point. And it's a mean, awful situation. There are going to be a lot of people go broke.
You know, and Bill, specifically on that point on prices going negative, for commodities, what does that really mean? What did that mean that we saw earlier this week in the market?
Well, it doesn't mean that we're negative. You want me to explain that trade real quick?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a difference between a physical trade and a paper trade. And Brent oil trades on paper, and all of it's an insurance policy, so to speak. You're buying insurance to make sure that you get a certain amount for your oil instead of when the price is low, you might get a little better price. There's many different ways to do that. But Brent trades are paper trades. And so when you're faced with a big loss on your paper trade, if you want to accept that loss and no one will take the other side of the trade, you can just let it go. But if you are in the physical side, which is what West Texas Intermediate is, you have to take physical possession of the oil. And what happened was one of the big ETFs, we didn't know whether it was a big ETF, a number of ETFs, or a major oil company maybe even, that got in a squeeze because storage is full, pipe is full, tanks are full, frac tanks are full, railroad cars are full, ships are full. There is nowhere to put physical oil. And what happened to this ETF was that they had to start unloading these trades. And it's a regular commodity bark out deal. And all of a sudden it went south on them. And all of a sudden people are saying, well, I'll take it, but you're going to have to pay me $35 a barrel to take it off your hands. And you have a choice. You can either sell it to me or give it to me and pay me $35 a barrel to take it, or you can put it in your front yard. So you decide. And so that's how we got into this squeeze that was just a downward spiral. You know, you've seen the markets come back a little bit here in the last 2 days. We're back up to 17 today on the Merc. The other thing I would add for people that aren't familiar with the oil business is that these NYMEX postings and these Brent postings are really pretty meaningless in the field. For instance, right now we have what we call a differential of about $8 to $10 a barrel. So even though oil closed at 17 on the Merc, the actual operators in the field are getting 10 or 7 and maybe. And so obviously 17 is not viable, but 7 is still shut in territory for sure, because you can't operate for $7 a barrel. So I hope that helped. I don't know if you need any more on that.
No, I think that's really good. And, you know, in Grant, from the service side, you know, when operators are getting such a low value for the crude they're producing and they don't have a place to put it, there's going to be a lot of changes in the way that operations occur out in the field. And that's when, for a lot of people that don't understand the way that the industry works, is you've got operators like Bill who find the properties, develop the plans to get the crude out of the ground, but then they turn to somebody like you in the service industry to do so much of that work. There's so many people that are employed on the service side of our industry. What are you seeing from your vantage point and how we've gotten to where we're at, how it's different than what we've experienced before? and then how you guys are maybe trying to adjust.
Well, you started seeing some of this several months ago when you started seeing announcements of capital expenditure, capital budgets for so many companies being reduced. And that's only escalated as the crisis has increased. So you're seeing major companies reducing their budgets 50%, and you're seeing smaller companies just completely eliminating their budget. Now that's for capital projects. So if you're a producer or a manufacturer of equipment, you have no home for that now. Then from an actual field service standpoint, especially if you're on the drilling and the completion side, that has really stopped cold in its tracks as well. We have to be more on the production side and the environmental side, so our services are needed, but we've had more than a few conversations with oil producers to reduce our cost or reduce our prices, and also to start really targeting certain wells to do work on. You're starting to see quite a bit of shut-ins going on, which eliminates those wells to do service on completely. So it's really, really reducing our top line. And then when you see that service companies generally are operating on a 20% net margin, maybe some even lower than that, when you start decreasing the revenue side 10, 15% at least, or eliminating projects, it really starts squeezing you very fast.
That's been the big concern that so many folks have that I've talked to, is that in years past, in downturns past, we've had two different types of kind of recoveries. We've had the V-shaped recoveries where we drop and we come back up, and then we've had the more U-shaped recoveries where we're in a trough for a while. And I think right now most people don't know exactly how long it's going to take to recover. Because we don't know when we're going to be getting back out of our homes. We don't know when people are going to be able to stop social distancing and get back to work. In particular, start needing the products that come from refined crude. Whether you're talking about jet fuel for airlines or diesel and gasoline for cars, as well as so many of the other aspects of equipment or materials that come from the refinement of crude. So one of the things that we've seen so much on the national level and on the state level is a response from government in trying to help. And that's not limited just to our industry. It's something that there's been a response to so many different facets, whether you're talking about healthcare, small businesses, to try to help the American people through this. Royce, what have you been seeing kind of on the state side specifically for the oil and gas industry? There are some things that people are trying to do.
Yeah, the two things I've noticed that are remarkable, a lot of remarkable things about this situation. The one is that, the fact that this market collapse is happening at, part of it's due to COVID, but part of it's due to other market forces. But the fact that it's happening at the same time as COVID, in any other normal time, like back in the 80s, I guess, this market collapse, even before the COVID effects, just the market collapse would be the #1 issue facing state government. And it would be the #1 crisis, and the state leadership would probably be spending about, 90% of its attention would be on this oil market collapse. But coming as it has, coinciding with COVID, I lobby for clients in different industries, so I get a feel of what the state leadership is really focused on. And, this may not be in the top 5 of the crises that the leadership is dealing with on any particular day. They may not be spending more than 15 to 20% of their day thinking about how to help oil and gas, just because they're spending so much time on drafting the state order to reopen the economy, or worrying about ventilators, or how are they going to process millions of unemployment applications, or, a million things. And just in terms of revenue, obviously this oil and gas collapse is going to, poke a huge hole in state and local revenues, but it's only one of dozens of holes. And, a much bigger one will be just general sales taxes. And around about June, we're going to start getting a reports on really how bad the state sales tax collections are going. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think it's just kind of remarkable of how limited the tools are that state government really has to respond to this market collapse in oil. You know, the Railroad Commission so far has tried, you know, they want to be seen as doing something, but so far it's kind of regulatory flexibility. They're gonna let your permits last a little longer than the expiration date. They're gonna cut some paperwork or give you more time to file certain reports. You know, obviously those things are not gonna save the industry or help with prices. Now, some industry players, some major industry players have suggested that the Railroad Commission use its proration authority, and don't feel bad if you don't know, if you haven't heard that term, because the Railroad Commission hasn't used that authority in almost 50 years. But proration would be where the Railroad Commission uses its authority to order a industry-wide, statewide cut in production, let's say 20%. And some industry players have asked the commission to do that, with arguing that perhaps that might help with prices, or at least it will allow for kind of an orderly way for the entire industry to cut production and perhaps allow more companies to survive. Now, there's a lot of major industry players that have come out against the idea. Probably not surprising. You know, the industry has a lot of very strong capitalist, free market, anti-government regulation types. And so they're making the argument that, one, it's just, you know, even a 20% cut in production really isn't going to help prices that much, considering that this is a global oil market and obviously there's a huge demand issue. And they also make the argument that, well, the free market can do the same curtailment because obviously as prices plummet, companies are just going to cut production on themselves. And these people argue that the free market will engineer those cuts much more efficiently than the Railroad Commission could. So right now, that's the biggest idea on the table. There's only one out of 3 elected commissioners strongly supports that idea. The other 2 seem hesitant or skeptical. And it's hard to predict how that would go. I predict it's not going to happen. They're not going to proration unless perhaps President Trump were to step in and engineer some big plan that he negotiates for a few nations to join in curtailment. And then if Trump were to ask several states to participate, including Texas, I could see the politics changing pretty quickly if the president got involved. But otherwise, it really just shows how big a problem this is and how little state government can really come to the rescue.
Royce, I think that's a good summary of so many of the things that are out there. And the interesting thing that I've seen from a trade association standpoint is the almost more than just open door policy from so many elected officials on give us your ideas, give us anything that you have thought of that can be helpful. You know, Bill, one of the things that Royce touched on had to do with taxes, in particular severance taxes, but there's also ad valorem taxes and there's sales taxes out there. There's a lot of taxes that the oil and gas industry pays, similar to a lot of other industries out there. If you, Bill, were looking at trying to see what could a government entity kind of do to help, do you think it's more on the trying to help on the tax side, or do you think it's more on the side of something like pro-rationing or trying to delay permitting or anything like that?
Stephen, I think pro-rationing is crazy. The fact of the matter is we have such a demand problem that cutting anything by the force of the government means absolutely nothing. Basically, Canada shut in, Mexico shut in, we're shutting in the Gulf of Mexico, we're shut in the field because our oil won't be taken. I want to make sure everybody understands that our purchasers are saying, you can produce it, but we won't take it. There's nowhere to go. So believe me, the market is doing it. You know, I don't like proration, and I'm a small guy. Most of the big guys like it and little guys don't. I don't like proration because I like to run our business the most efficient way we can. I don't like government interference. And right now, they could prorate it all they wanted to. It wouldn't make any difference. I can't sell any. So it wouldn't make, I mean, it doesn't, it's a moot question. And I was listening to Pickering this morning, and he made the point, you know, it's a demand problem. If we can ever get demand to come back, maybe we could think about it, but we don't want to give up market share to Oklahoma or Nebraska or to Illinois or North Dakota or Montana or to any of the other OPEC nations. When we shut in arbitrarily, we're just giving up market share. So what we need to do, I think, is that's a quick synopsis. I think we need to let the proration go. As you know, I'm just a fanatic that the ad valorem taxes in this state are ridiculously run. It's a racket. And one of the things that they could do to help us tremendously, what'll happen this year is when they run those ad valorem tax numbers, they're going to run them at $60 because that's where the year ended last year or January. I don't know which one they used, December or January.
Yeah, it's January.
We're at zero. Okay. So they're going to charge us the same thing for ad valorem taxes that they charged us last year. Oh, we got no money to pay it. And so that, you know, and I know the schools are run off ad valorems, but, you know, there's no way that we can put, what you're going to see is when that ad valorem tax comes due, you're going to see a lot of small guys go out of business if they do that. Of course, severance tax is the same way. I just want to point out to everybody, I'm sure this is a well-informed group and they know this, but 100% of the rainy day fund comes from the oil and gas business. It doesn't come from Sam's Club, and it doesn't come from IBM, and it doesn't come from Abbott Labs. It comes 100% from our business. One of the things that they could do is give us a severance tax holiday right away would help. And of course, sales taxes too. We pay a tremendous amount in sales taxes. Our little company, and we're little, paid millions in taxes last year.
You know, that's something that I've heard from a lot of folks that even it's not even the idea of forgive, but yeah, holiday, and maybe push back a bit, maybe have a referral or a deferral that we could push a month or two down to try to just help out in the meantime to save a lot of companies and a lot of jobs. The oil and gas industry employs so many people in this state and employs people in high compensated positions that then have a big impact on the rest of the economy. Whether it's spending that disposable income in travel or in food or in any other kind of goods, they help to employ so many other aspects of the economy. Grant, I want to bring you back in from the service side. You're hearing a lot of these same kind of ideas that are thrown out on things that could help the industry. Is there anything that you've heard out there that you think is a good idea? Anything you've heard out there that you think just kind of we just need to move on from? Anything that in particular could help the service guys? And Grant, you've got yourself on mute right now.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
It's, you know, clearly there's been federal programs put in place, the PPP loan program, emergency loans, deferrals of debt payment, but unfortunately that only takes care of a short period of time. Even if you do a deferral of your severance or ad valorems, you know, that only helps for a period of time until you solve the issue of the demand side or the supply side, but really the demand side, I agree with Bill. It's if you get the demand side figured out, it sure will wash out some of this oil. So for so many of the service companies, so many of the small or even larger public and independent oil companies, those with a lot of debt, and if their bankers aren't going to work with them, I don't see how they're going to end up with the cash flow to be able to take care of that. And again, it's not just the oil companies. You look at like Pecos, Texas. They have 23 hotels in that little area. And most of them are probably pretty close to empty. And probably most of them were built with debt. And so what's going to happen with those type companies? So not to be too negative here, but until you get the demand side taken care of, any of the things that the federal government programs or the deferrals might help will just be kind of kicking the can down the road for a interim period.
You know, and something kind of a comparison, the growth in the Permian Basin specifically, and obviously I have a little bit more familiarity with that region than other producing regions around the state, but the growth in that region has generated a tax base that goes to Austin, similar to the way the relationship works between the state of Texas and Washington, D.C., where we send a lot more taxes to the capital than we get value back out. And that's not a complaint about we need to get our fair share. That's more of a warning to people out there that as property values plummet, as people could go out of business and can no longer provide that tax base, that's going to be a huge hit to the state budget that is going to be struggling at a time to try to help out so many different facets of our economy. So whatever can be done to try to help these companies limp along long enough to be able to stay in business to where demand does come back in is going to be greatly beneficial for the entire state. But something that West Texas is known for outside of hydrocarbon energy production is renewable energy production. The wind energy that is, or the electricity generated from wind turbines out in the Permian Basin, from solar panels out in the Permian Basin, has made that region a tremendous source of renewable energy. What are any of y'all hearing or seeing as an impact to the renewable side of the energy equation from this downturn, specifically because of COVID-19, but also just generally because of the drop in the price of oil?
Well, just from a political standpoint, you know, there have been some well-publicized tweets the last couple of days of people on one extreme saying that somehow that this oil collapse will just totally open the way for renewables. But I'm not really sure how they're figuring that. Typically, renewables politically are sometimes can be a bit of a luxury good, in that an economy needs to be doing very well, and perhaps a government needs to have enough money to help subsidize some of those emerging renewable technologies. And it also helps when oil is really expensive, and so some of those new technologies are more competitive. And in the current situation, I think, you know, one, you're going to have, unfortunately for a while, some very, very cheap oil. You're also going to have governments that don't have a lot of extra money to put towards subsidies. And third, you're going to have consumers who are unemployed and struggling, and who may not be as interested in supporting slightly more expensive renewable technologies, may not be quite as interested in spending that money as they were a year or so ago.
Grant, Bill, do either of you have anything to add to that?
One of the big drivers of the renewables is because it's so environmentally friendly compared to oil and gas industry. And it's obviously the environmental side is now way down on the list. The whole concern about ESG is way down on the list. But one of the byproducts of this market is we're not going to be drilling as much. We're going to have wells shut in. Therefore, we're not going to be doing near as much flaring. There won't be near as much of kind of that public sentiment kind of going against the oil industry because of the, you know, it's so visible to see a flare bright in the sky, and that causes folks to want to go to renewables and kind of go away from the oil and gas industry. Well, you see on the news about how all the skies are nice and clean now that there's no traffic. Well, you're going to see the same thing within the oil industry. So it's going to make it very, renewables are tough. That's a tough economic situation anyway, because of the return on investment and the amount of capital associated with windmills and all those other things, and low oil price, low environmental hit that we're going to be seeing right now just really drives away the need for any type of renewable.
one of the areas that we've seen that renewables come into the equation out in the Permian Basin is electric transmission and distribution. The need for electricity in oil and gas operations, I think so many people outside the industry don't understand the amount of electricity that we need and we value in field operations. Now, in particular, when trying to discuss that issue with state regulators, the difficulty has traditionally been that oil and gas operations operate kind of on a 6 to 12, if not 18-month time frame of original idea to implementation, getting operations going in the field, needing that electricity. Whereas transmission and distribution systems take much longer, take 3 to 5 years to get from idea to implementation and ready to transmit electricity in the field. So you've seen a lot of substation building by individual companies. You've also seen reliance on kind of island type of solar energy production or wind energy production. That's one area in particular that I think that we might see a strengthening in relationship between the oil and gas industry and renewables, not necessarily for that electricity to get out of areas where generation of hydrocarbons is occurring, but the need to get that electricity to those facilities. But you're absolutely right. If the price point gets to where it's more expensive to do that, than to rely on electricity from the grid, if it's available, or from self-generation, I can see it struggling, and we'll have to see how that unfolds as we move forward. So guys, we've talked about so many of the different ideas that people have thrown out. Bill has really hit it on the head of what so many people have talked about, that it's a demand issue. And until we get back to the point where demand increases, we're not going to be able to really benefit the production side or get people back to a level. So what can we do in the meantime? What do you see happening in the meantime? Because we're right now, we're not looking at a tomorrow we're going to be able to get back to work and demand is going to increase. And if we do get to a point where the governor says, all right, we're completely in the clear, everybody get back to work, go back to your jobs, that's in the state of Texas. It's not in the United States. It's not in the world. So how long of a time frame maybe are we looking at the world economy kind of getting back going if we all get the green light to be able to get back to work? What are we looking at out there? Bill, I might start with you on that one, since you've been involved a lot in trying to figure out what you guys need to do internally to adjust your operations. What signals are maybe you looking for to be able to decide, okay, we really do need to get production kind of back to where that was before, if not even grow it?
Even if I get too far off in the weeds, let me know. But I'm going to say, generally speaking, no one knows, obviously. Anybody that prognosticates is wrong. But I don't see demand coming back to a level where we could get above 30 or 40 best by the end of the year. If it comes roaring back, we might get back to 50 or 60 next year, but there's going to be a lot of carnage in between. There's really nothing we can do but everybody shut in and wait. But I would say this, if we're talking about government intervention, as they said, we all hate it. We don't like it. We're active. We have guys like you and guys like the TIPRO that I'm a board member of to help us. And I'm sure Royce works on these issues. But one thing I think they could do is, and a lot of people don't understand this, that all of the refineries, or basically all the refineries in Texas, refine sour oil, because that's what Saudi Arabia sent us for many years. And Saudi Arabia owns at least one and maybe 2 or 3 refineries that are big refineries. And the oil that's coming our direction from them, I don't know it'd do any good to embargo it, because it's just going to take it to their refineries. But I think what we could do is shut their refineries down. And I think it would help a little bit because, let our refineries do the refining and take them out of that equation. But at the end of the day, I'd love to see an embargo, but I don't think it would help. Again, I think we got a demand. I don't think an embargo would help any, because I don't think there's any more coming than they can refine. So I think it's going to be a really tough couple of years. And like you said, the state needs to be ready to strap it on, because the revenues that they expect, Glenn's been all over it, everything is going to be way down. Everything. Sales taxes are going to be awful, as we all know. I mean, not just from us, but from everything else. So yeah, the state of Texas is lucky to have us in a rainy day fund, but even the rainy day fund may not be enough to pull us through this without some really good thinking about it.
I'll just remind everyone, if you don't recall from your 7th grade Texas civics class, that our legislature will not be back into session until January 2021. So, theoretically they could call a special session, but so far there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in that. So, there's certain things the comptroller or the Railroad Commission can do, but for larger measures to try and help the industry, a lot of them would probably have to wait to January before they could even start really discussing it.
If you start looking at kind of what could be happening over the next several months, not every company is created equally, and that comes down to what type of production they have and what type of capital structure and operating cost structure they have. And the only way to really handle a cyclical business is to have the proper capital structure in place and not have too much debt. And so those that have too much debt are going to be going out of business or consolidating. There's been rumors all along about or theories all along about how West Texas will have a significant roll-up of companies. And, you see larger companies, the Chevrons and Exxons, that have plenty of dry powder. Now they can pick up a lot of the independents out there for a lot cheaper than they could have 6 months ago or 12 months ago. And so so those larger companies, there most likely will be a lot fewer of them out there. Then you also look at the stripper producer, the ones that have under, say, an average of 15 barrels a day. Those are high cost wells that can't usually be operated when you have pricing coming close to these prices. Well, they're going to have to shut those in because they're producing them on a negative cash flow basis. Well, you do that, there's always a risk that production doesn't come back. Or if the company goes out, you could be looking at something very historic in that the state of Texas could end up being a proud owner of a lot of different shut-in and abandoned wells, which creates a huge environmental challenge for them to either plug it or to try to redistribute that. So it's, again, not trying to be too negative here, but it's, if things don't turn around in the next 6 months or so, it's going to create huge issues for oil companies. And then, as I mentioned, service and all the peripheral, the hotels and the cities and all that, they're going to follow suit with huge shortcomings of income.
And Grant, something that we've seen so many times before is you have the question as a trade association, we get asked often in good times and in bad, well, what is the break-even point? What do producers need to be able to stay in business? And the reality is it changes all the time because it depends on what the service cost is. Mm-hmm. If oil's at $120, but it takes $115 to pay for the equipment and for the people to produce it, then that's the break-even cost. If it's at $50 and the price for services is at $40, then that's the break-even cost. But with the type of demand destruction that we're seeing out there, I tend to wonder, are we getting to a point where if it lasts long enough, will that demand ever come back? And Castlen, you might want to jump in on this one as well, as a larger company that has assets outside of even the United States for production. Maybe what have you guys seen, or what are you guys thinking about where demand could go in the future, even if we do get to a recovery?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. And I know I'm not an official panelist, so thanks for letting me speak. And I didn't introduce that in my day job, outside of my time with the Lyceum, I run communications and public affairs for Apache Corporation, which is a large oil and gas company with global operations. And I think to your question, Stephen, about permanent demand destruction, I think that is a real concern. And part of that is not so much a function of how long this lasts, because there's certainly some possibility that this could last a while. But I also think the underlying issue here is demand as a function of our use of those products. And that's tied to all of the things that you talked about earlier, like transportation and traveling on airplanes, traveling by car. And I think some of the things that we have learned over the past month or so is that many of the things that we traditionally relied on transport to do, we don't quite need as much. I think all of us have been working from home, and I think it's been a massive experiment in the ability of folks to work from home. And I think that there will be permanent impacts from that when we go back, even when we go back full time and everybody's healthy and ready and the state is completely open and the country is completely open and the world is completely open. There will be residual behavioral impacts. I mean, look at telemedicine, look at university education, look at all of the things that we've been forced to do remotely and not have to get into our car in the morning and travel and burn fuel to do it. So I think there is a possibility that there could be some permanent demand destruction. Now, at the same time, when you look at predictions before COVID-19, energy demand across all sectors, not just oil and gas, but just global energy demand, always is considered or is expected to grow over time as the populations grow over time. So we'll get back to some new normal after this, but I just think behaviors may drive some changes, permanent changes to that.
You know, and I've seen plenty of reports that talk about the fact that because energy demand worldwide is growing so much, even if things like renewable energy were able to increase the energy they provide to the greater system by tenfold in the next 5 to 10 years, hydrocarbon production still needs to increase to meet the growing energy demand. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues to be the case or not. We have become such a global economy that just thrives on energy. Hydrocarbon in particular has been an energy source that has been affordable, reliable, and transportable. And it's something that can move across the globe and be stored, something that we've not really been able to fully develop with just electricity yet. So we don't have that battery system in the United States, in developed countries, let alone in developing countries, where you can produce that energy and store it for when it really needs to be used. And so that's one of the reasons why we still have such a reliance on hydrocarbon energy. And if that greater demand shrinks, then we'll see if that still continues to be the case or if we're able to make a shift. Anybody else, have you been hearing anything else on, or have any thoughts on that greater idea of long-term, if not permanent, demand destruction?
Stephen, I was listening to Pickering this morning, and I think I've got it right. And if I'm quoting him wrong, I apologize. But I think what he said this morning was that where we were was about 98 million barrels a day as this thing began to occur. He said he thought there was a good chance that it would come back to that 98 million by next year. And that's why I said maybe we get back to 60 by that time. But he also said if it gets down to, say, 92 and holds there for a couple of years, it could be a really, really tough couple of years. But you can't be a pessimist and be in our business. And I really believe that we will break out pretty fast. And as you said, I think the developing countries in particular, with populations that are growing really fast, are going to have a great need for what we have, us as well. And as you said before, that renewable stuff, I was on the Texas Energy Planning Council when we passed all the wind legislation, and I'm not proud of that. But I helped write that legislation, shot my own feet off. But they're expensive, and they're a novelty, and they're something that's fun to play with. But these developing companies certainly can't afford that. And so I'm with you. I think we're going to always have a big demand. But I will say this: that Pickering was saying that maybe we can come out of this by 21. All we can do is hope.
You take Castlen's point about the change in the dynamics out there, and I think you have to apply that to the oil industry, where we're going to have to lower our cost of production. And how do you do that? You either eliminate certain layers of overhead, you become more efficient, you use technology. We're spending a lot of time developing various ways of automating how we do from service tickets to capturing performance of equipment, and doing that on a web-based type system so that one person can oversee a much larger area of activity. And where it used to be more labor focused, which translates to cost, now you're able to use technology to eliminate some of that, the cost function of the labor and everything associated with that.
You know, and that's something that we talk about, whether it's the international demand destruction or the employment-based destruction, the tax-based destruction. We also see the federal government trying to put a lot of proposals out there, if not pass legislation, to help with funding. In a time when we're going to have an economy that isn't running as strong, not producing as much, not have as much sales tax, not have as much wealth generation in the development of properties, where do you see subsidies for so many different things kind of going, any of you? And Royce, maybe you'd be a good one to kind of take this one on. Where do we see subsidies for so many different things outside of the COVID-19 focused subsidies that we're seeing happening? I mean, when governments do have to get back together, in particular in Texas, when they convene back in Austin and they're trying to look at what are we going to do with our state budget? Where's our revenue going to come from? What programs are out there that we had been supporting that we're not really going to be able to support as much anymore? Any ideas on that? I know it's still a long way off and there's still a lot that's going to change between now and then, but it's the kind of things that we've got to start thinking about so when it happens, we're ready for it.
Yeah. Well, it is hard to predict how bad the damage is going to be to the budget, but obviously it's going to be severe. And at least in past sessions that I've worked, whenever the energy industry has been in a down market, there's been I think a pretty good appreciation for the industry at the legislature, and they understand how important it is to the economy and to the state budget. And I think it's just going to be interesting this time around, this coming session, when it's going to be the energy industry in a downturn, but also the restaurant industry in a downturn, and just everyone's going to be in a downturn. And it's just going to be interesting, you know, how much love is the energy industry going to get in proportion to all these other industries.
Well, and on that point of what industries are being impacted, a big announcement that was made this last year by the University of Texas system was a scholarship that was funded by revenues from royalties on university lands, specifically in the Permian Basin. What's going to happen to higher education? We've had a panel already that's talked about higher education for the Lyceum, but from the energy standpoint, how do we see that impact? I mean, is the funding for, and you guys might not be able to share expert opinions specifically on this, but you've got to have your own opinions. We're tied to education in the state. I mean, the way the universities have been able to fund themselves for so many years is because of the resources underneath university lands. So what kind of impacts are we going to see with that? That's going to be another group that's going to be asking questions about how do we get funding?
Well, and I'll just also point out what most people know about Texas government is that we have to run a balanced budget every 2 years. So the flexibility, for better or worse, that the federal government has right now to go into further deficits and get money pumped into the economy is just not a tool that the Texas government has. You know, Texans probably aren't going to like this too much, but you know, we in other states may be looking to the federal government for a huge amount of cash to reach a balanced budget without totally butchering our state government.
Yeah, you know, even in areas, one of the areas that we've seen that impacted on outside of specifically energy, but you look at the sports world and how things have changed so much there, and in particular for universities. So many university sports programs are funded by the revenues generated by the football program, Well, there's so many programs in the state of Texas that are funded by generating revenues from the oil and gas industry. I think it's going to be a huge dramatic shift, and it's going to be an incredibly tough session. So we'll see. I think I was always told that the easiest session for legislators were sessions where they could say no because they didn't have any money, because they said no to everybody. But I don't really think that's going to be the case this come around in 2021. I think it's going to be quite difficult. Grant or Bill, do you guys have anything to add to that or jump in there?
Well, Stephen, I would say this. You know, I think that we could have done away with Robin Hood the last session. Over 10%. I'm sorry, 2% of our biennial budget. If everybody would have cut their pencils and paper by 2%, it's coffee money. They wouldn't do it. So the good news is, in a way, is that we always have dead wood to be cut out. I'll just use an example. I was working with one of the professors over at the UT that was running his department. And the last time I saw this happen, Perry just told everybody, we're cutting by 10%. Strap it on. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you are. And I don't care what your agency is. You're cutting 10%. And everybody screamed and hollered and said they couldn't do it. And actually they did it pretty easy. But I was talking to this guy that was running his department. I won't say who it is because you might know him. But I said, aren't you really worried about that? And he said, no. He said, we've got so much dead wood around here that I could not let go because they were, you know, had the, whatever you call it, somebody tell me, where they can't fire one of those guys, one of those profs. But he said, I'm ready to get rid of a few of them, and I don't have to say anything except, hey, I'm not in control. Governor Perry made us do this, and you just happen to be hired last or on the hit list. And so in a way, and believe me, I don't want anybody to suffer. I don't want Medicaid or, you know, people that are hurting to hurt more. And believe me, us in the oil business is going to be hurting too. But I'm not too worried about our state budget because Texas has always been able to strap it on when they had to. That's what we do. Texans lead and everybody else follows. And I know it's going to be really hard on those guys, but as you said, it's going to be easy to say no to everybody. And as long as it doesn't get too political, I think we'll pull through it. Royce knows a lot more about it than I would. See what he said.
Well, and Royce, I was going to say on that point, we're kind of getting to the last 5-10 minutes of our time here. So I am going to kind of round that into seeing what kind of final bits of wisdom shots you guys have to kind of throw out there. You know, we've talked a lot about how the industry is being impacted. We've talked a little bit about how that really impacts people outside the industry, but in particular, we've talked about it on tax bases. We've talked about in particular with the permanent university fund through the university lands system. We've talked a good bit about so many different things, but what's the most important thing people really need to understand about what's going on in our industry and how that impacts them as Texans out there? And Royce, I'll start with you on that one.
Well, you know, those of us that lobby for the industry spend a lot of time talking to the legislature about the economic impact of the industry, but you know, people may not really realize that there's, I think it's $16 billion in state and local tax revenues and 430,000 high-paying jobs. And so, you know, Texas is not as dependent on oil and gas as it was a few decades ago, but it's still very dependent. You know, and I think Grant mentioned this, that there's especially certain counties where oil and gas revenue is tax revenue is more than 50%, sometimes like 70% of their budgets. So this downturn is going to affect people in a lot of ways they don't even realize.
You know, let me just throw out a little kind of a side note on all this is that, you know, the oil industry has been probably not its best, has not done its best job in promoting itself because of some of the environmental issues, the ups and downs of the price, all the flaring. And so hopefully, while it's way down on the list of priorities, I do hope that the environmental side doesn't get lost, the ESG side doesn't get lost, because, you know, when this comes back, we need to position ourselves as an industry to be able to be much more acceptable to the nation from an environmental side, from a society governance side. And so I think it's, you know, it's going to be interesting to see how all the rules, the environmental EPA, Railroad Commission rules are applied during this downtime, whether they're waived or continued. There's a lot of cost associated with that, but it can also kind of get out of control if you start waiving a lot of those. So it's going to be interesting to see how the state responds.
Bill, do you have anything
Stephen,
else to add besides your?
I just wanted to add one thing to what he was talking about, what Grant was saying. I want everybody out there to understand that all of this flaring that's going on is going on most of the time because we're losing leases. And I don't know if they understand that. But if we don't produce the oil, we can't hold our leases. We have to flare because we don't have the takeaway capacity for the gas. It's considered a byproduct. But if they crack down on flaring too hard, they'll put another knife in our back. Yes, we need to work on it, but it's a pipeline problem and not a producer problem. And people need to understand we have to have takeaway or we lose leases. I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, you're exactly right, Bill, but that also speaks to the need for innovation, because clearly that's a natural resource that if it can be converted into electricity or transported, and all of those have challenges and costs associated with it. But at some point we've got to solve that problem, not either from a public relations side or a regulatory side, or just from a pure use of a natural resource.
Grant, I agree, but I would say this, that until that time comes, and believe me, as a producer, if somebody would give me something for it, I guarantee it wouldn't be going up in smoke. I mean, if somebody brings me the innovation, I'd love to use it.
Sure.
It's just a part of life.
Well, thank you all for participating. Castlen has not been an official panelist on here, but she shared her 2 cents every now and then. And so I want to throw it to her one last time too, see if she has anything else to add, anything about the takeaway, maybe even a silver lining that we could kind of add to this conversation before we leave it.
Well, I will say, again, thank you all for participating. This was really interesting. Obviously a really important topic for the state. If I had to pick a silver lining, and I'm going to reach on this one because I don't see a whole lot of them right now, but Brad Morrison did ask the question, is there a silver lining in all of this? And one of the things that I think is truly Texan is if you look at what has happened over the last 10 years in the oil and gas industry and the ingenuity and the innovation that was brought to bear that put Texas in this position in the first place to be producing 5 million barrels a day and be, the topic of global conversation when it comes to, proration possibilities and how that could potentially even impact global markets. That when the oil and gas industry is faced with very low prices like we were faced with in 2014 and 2015, we innovated our way out of it and we lowered our break-even cost. So what could potentially come out of this is folks are going to have to work a lot harder to squeeze every last drop they can out of production and do it in the most cost-efficient way possible. And it's times like these where people become very efficient. And so we could overall lower our break-even, and Texas could, continue to see progress in terms of maintaining its position as a significant producer on the global stage.
I think that's great. And that's the kind of the silver lining, the last kind of comment I'll throw out there before we wrap this up is that the world continues to get closer. We continue to get closer to each other. And while this might be a setback where we've had to do some social distancing from each other across the globe, there are a lot of people out there that still want a better life. And energy is the key to a better life. Reliable, affordable energy is. And because of the kind of regulatory framework, the free market framework that we have in the United States, and in particular in the state of Texas, we can be the leader, as we have been before, in helping the world get back to a point of improving lives around the world. If you look at the statistics for worldwide extreme poverty, the drop in extreme poverty over the last 50 years almost mirrors the growth of hydrocarbon use as a primary energy source. And that's something that people in the energy industry should be very proud of. And that's something that we want to continue to be able to do, is to lift people out of not only poverty, but out of poor lives into better lives. That means clean water. That means reliable and good food. And all of those come from energy. And so I think that is the silver lining, that as the world continues to grow and as we have new pandemics or whatever it is around the next corner that we're going to face all together, we're going to need energy to be able to combat that. And there's not much of a better place in the world than Texas to be able to get that energy. So thank you all for participating on this panel. Thank you everyone for chiming in. I'm sorry we run a few minutes over. We really appreciate you all joining us. Look forward to joining you again in the future when we can do it all in person. But in particular, as these Lyceum panels continue week after week, please chime in. And as Castlen said, we are looking for candidates for our new Lyceum class for next year. So if you have any questions, if you have a way that you want to get somebody involved, please reach out to Lyceum leadership, Lyceum directors, to find out the best way to do that. Thank you everybody for being here, and we look forward to hosting and seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.